June 19, 1944. The Pacific dawn breaks over a restless sea. To the west of the Mariana Islands, Task Force 58 cuts through the waves like a floating city of steel. The mighty carriers USS Enterprise, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Yorktown, and 11 more giants of war stand ready. From their decks, hundreds of Grumman F6F Hellcats roar into the sky, an unstoppable swarm of American air power. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commands this formidable armada from his flagship, the Lexington .15. Carriers now form the largest concentration of naval aviation ever assembled. 905 aircraft poised to strike at Imperial Japan's last hope of halting America's advance toward its homeland aboard the Japanese carrier Taiho. Lieutenant Warrant Officer Sakio Kumatsu tightens the straps of his flight harness. It is 7:30 a.m. The ready room buzzes with tension and purpose. The morning briefing was clear. Strike hard, strike fast, and destroy the American carriers reported east of Guam. Intelligence estimates 15 large flat tops operating in 3 task groups southwest of Saipan. Today, Kumatsu is assigned to escort the second attack wave, what many aboard believe will be the decisive blow of the Pacific War. His Mitsubishi A6M50 is fitted with a centerline drop tank, extending its range to over 1,000 nautical miles. It's a clever adaptation that turns the Agile Zero into a long-range escort. Japan's naval air doctrine, forged in the victories of 1941 and 1942, still clings to the belief that superior maneuverability and coordinated strikes will overcome the heavier American machines. The beater tactics that once stunned the world at Pearl Harbor and Darwin were built on the genius of commanders. Like Minoru Genda, their doctrine emphasized the Zero's unmatched turning radius and incredible range, allowing Japanese pilots to dictate the terms of battle. For a time, the formula worked perfectly, but by mid-1944, the balance of power had shifted. Task Force 58 represents not just overwhelming numbers, but a revolution in naval warfare. Carriers larger, faster, and stronger than anything Japan can field. The new Essex-class carriers displace 27,000 tons each, with reinforced decks built to withstand direct hits. American designers sacrificed some speed for resilience, a decision born from hard lessons at Coral Sea and Midway. Unlike Japan's lightweight carriers, which traded armor for aircraft capacity, the U.S. Navy now prioritizes survivability and sustained operations. And above those decks flies the aircraft that will define air superiority for the rest of the war. The Grumman F6F Hellcat. Introduced in 1943, it was America's direct answer to the Zero. Grumman engineers studied captured Japanese planes and pilot combat reports, designing a machine that could meet and defeat the Zero on its own terms. Fully loaded, the Hellcat weighs 12,000 pounds and is powered by a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine. It can climb to 380 miles per hour and shrug off damage that would doom a lighter aircraft. The cockpit is protected by over 200 pounds of armor plate. Self-sealing fuel tanks guard against the infernos that consumed so many early war fighters. 650 caliber Browning machine guns, each with 400 rounds, give the Hellcat a devastating punch unmatched in the Pacific skies. Meanwhile, the Japanese strike force forms up over the Philippine Sea. From Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, 128 aircraft climb toward the east. At 24,000 feet, they search the horizon for any sign of the enemy. They expect surprise, but they are being tracked. Many of these aviators are mere shadows of the elite pilots who once ruled the Pacific. By 1944, Japan's training program had collapsed under the weight of war. Once 3 years long, pilot training had been cut to 6 months. New airmen graduate with barely 100 total flight hours and almost no gunnery experience. One of the few veterans still flying is Lieutenant Junior Grade Takeshi Yamamoto, a combat-seasoned pilot with over 600 hours in the cockpit. He has fought in the Dutch East Indies and over Rabaul, where the Zero once seemed invincible. His wingman, Ensign Hiroshi Tanaka, has only 75 hours of total flight time, barely enough to understand the basics of aerial combat. Fuel shortages eliminated advanced training, and ammunition scarcity meant most new pilots never fired their guns at moving targets. Many would enter combat without ever having faced a live enemy aircraft. The difference between veterans and replacements is now a chasm, one that no amount of bravery can bridge. As the Japanese formation presses east, American radar operators aboard the USS Yorktown detect their approach, 150 miles out. 20 minutes before visual contact, the U.S. fleet already knows the enemy's altitude, heading, and formation. This is a new kind of warfare. Fighter direction officers stationed inside each carrier's combat information center plot the incoming raid in real time. Using radar data and radio commands, they guide defending fighters with mathematical precision. What was once chaos is now an orchestrated defense. Commander David McCampbell, leading Fighting Squadron 15 from the USS Essex, receives the order to intercept. His 12 Hellcats climb through the clouds, throttles wide open. Each pilot has logged more than 300 flight hours and completed extensive training in gunnery and tactics back home. The U.S. Navy's aviation schools now produce over 10,000 new pilots every year, each one better trained, better equipped, and more confident than their Japanese counterparts. The Hellcat's cockpit is a fortress. Thick bulletproof glass shields the pilot's head and chest. The self-sealing fuel tanks can take multiple hits without leaking. During testing, the aircraft remained controllable even after absorbing several 20mm cannon rounds. The pilots trust their machines completely, and that trust makes them fearless. At 9:15 a.m., 90 miles west of Guam, the two formations meet. The sky erupts. Hellcats dive from above, their engines screaming. They strike from the sun, unseen until the last second. Ensign Tanaka sees a blur flash past his canopy, a Hellcat diving straight at him. He jerks left, trying to force an overshoot, but the American fighter stays glued to his tail. The Zero's light frame begins to shudder. Its controls stiffen. The Hellcat's power allows it to sustain turns the Zero cannot match. A burst of .50 caliber fire tears through Tanaka's aircraft. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds ignite his fuel tank. The Zero vanishes in a fireball. One more life consumed by the brutal arithmetic of modern air combat. All around, similar scenes unfold. The veterans realize with horror that the Zero's legendary agility means little against an opponent that can absorb hits and fight on. The myths of aerial superiority crumble in moments. Commander McCampbell leads his division through another attack run. Hellcats dive from 28,000 feet, striking at over 450 miles per hour before zooming back to altitude. It is a deadly rhythm: strike, climb, strike again. The Japanese try to dogfight, turning tightly in desperate spirals, but the Americans refuse to play that game. They use their speed and firepower, not agility, to win. Each section of Hellcats moves as one. Pilots cover one another, staying in formation, maintaining discipline. Their radio coordination is flawless, guided by clear, powerful transmitters. Japanese pilots, meanwhile, struggle with weak, crackling radios that often fail entirely. Many switch them off, relying on hand signals, a fatal disadvantage in the chaos of aerial battle. Within minutes, the Japanese formations disintegrate. 12 Zeros fall in the first engagement, most without scoring a single hit. American pilots are astonished by how poorly their opponents shoot. Bursts go wide, tracers trailing harmlessly behind. Training failures are written in every missed shot and every fatal mistake. Lieutenant Alexander Vrachiew from the USS Lexington intercepts a second Japanese wave attempting to break through. Leading just 4 Hellcats, he tears into 12 enemy aircraft, destroying 6 in 8 minutes. He fires only a fraction of his ammunition, 360 rounds of the 2,400 carried. It is a massacre. The 50 caliber guns rip through the fragile Zeros with terrifying ease. Wings shear off. Engines burst into flame. In some cases, only 2 or 3 seconds of fire are enough to obliterate an enemy aircraft. The Japanese 20mm cannons, once feared for their destructive power, now seem pitifully inadequate. Low muzzle velocity and poor accuracy mean few hits land. And when they do, the Hellcats simply keep flying. By mid-morning, the Pacific sky belongs entirely to the Americans. What Japan's aviators had hoped would be their redemption has become their ruin. Hundreds of aircraft burn across the ocean, their wreckage marking the end of Japan's carrier air power. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would later be remembered by American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But in June 1944, it was something far greater than a victory. It was the moment the Imperial Navy lost the sky forever. The battle over the Philippine Sea was no longer a contest of courage. It had become a test of systems, technology, and training. As Japanese formations pushed eastward, the Americans had already transformed the art of defense into a science. Radar-directed fighter control gave Task Force 58 an all-seeing eye. Within darkened rooms aboard every carrier, radar operators tracked incoming waves of enemy aircraft as glowing blips sweeping across phosphor screens. Fighter direction officers, men trained to think three-dimensionally, issued calm, precise orders over VHF radio, vectoring each Hellcat division toward the exact altitude and bearing of their targets. This coordination turned chaos into choreography. The Japanese, once masters of the skies, now faced a machine of perfect timing. Their formations, launched with discipline and determination, arrived not as one great blow, but as scattered fragments, each intercepted and dismantled before it could ever threaten the American carriers. At 8:56 a.m., Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched his second wave, 128 aircraft, drawn from every flight-ready machine remaining in his fleet. The strike force included 48 Zero fighters, 53 Judy dive bombers, and 27 Jill torpedo bombers. Their mission, to overwhelm American defenses by sheer volume, was already doomed by the realities of training and fatigue. Most of these pilots were barely qualified to land on a carrier. Navigation over the vast Pacific tested even veterans. For these men, it was nearly impossible. As the formation stretched across the morning sky, small groups lost contact, veering off course into the endless blue. Some circled aimlessly until their fuel ran dry, disappearing into the ocean without ever seeing an enemy. 60 miles from Task Force 58, Lieutenant Russell Reiser of Fighting Squadron 31 aboard the USS Cabot spotted the lead elements of the incoming Japanese wave. The Hellcats dove from the sun, their approach unseen until tracer fire slashed through the sky. The Japanese failed to maintain proper lookout, a fatal lapse born of inexperience. Within moments, 5 enemy planes were burning wrecks spiraling into the sea. The survivors pressed on, only to meet another line of interceptors waiting at higher altitude. Each American formation operated like a well-oiled trap, a diving attack from above, a quick burst of gunfire, then a climb back to altitude to reset. The Hellcats controlled the tempo, dictating when and where to fight. The Zeros could only react. Here, energy management became the deciding factor. American pilots had trained relentlessly to fight not by instinct, but by mathematics, preserving altitude and speed, trading one for the other as the situation demanded. The Japanese, taught to rely on agility and instinctive dogfighting, found themselves helpless at the higher speeds, where their aircraft became sluggish and unresponsive. By the time fragments of the second wave broke through to visual range of the fleet, they were disorganized and depleted. American anti-aircraft batteries opened up in layered fury. The destroyers and cruisers guarding the carriers unleashed a storm of proximity-fused shells, tiny radar-guided explosives that detonated near their targets, shredding wings and fuselages before the attackers could line up their runs. Only one torpedo bomber managed to release its weapon, and even that failed. The USS Indiana evaded the slow-moving torpedo with a sharp turn, leaving the ocean to swallow the weapon harmlessly. Meanwhile, Commander David McCampbell, leading the 2nd Division of VF-15, spotted the 3rd Japanese wave around 11 a.m. 12 Hellcats dove into a formation of over 40 enemy aircraft. What followed was less a battle than a rout. McCampbell personally shot down 7 Japanese planes in 20 minutes. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, destroyed 4 more. Together, they annihilated an entire squadron before the enemy even reached the American fleet. The engagement revealed the stark truth. Japan's naval air arm was collapsing. Pilots who survived described their formations dissolving in confusion, each man fighting alone, abandoning the mission in a desperate attempt to survive. Lieutenant Commander Kenji Suzuki, his Zero riddled with bullet holes and engine sputtering, limped back toward the fleet. His aircraft barely held together. Control cables severed, fuel leaking, the engine coughing black smoke. From his cockpit, he saw the Pacific littered with burning aircraft. Never before had Japan's Navy endured such a one-sided disaster. Not even Midway had been this hopeless. The few planes that made it back told a story that stunned the Japanese command. Pilots spoke of an American fighter unlike anything they had ever faced. Faster, stronger, and virtually indestructible. Their 7.7mm machine guns barely scratched its armor, while its 6 heavy Brownings tore Zeros apart with terrifying ease. Intelligence officers aboard Taiho realized their assumptions had been disastrously wrong. All wartime estimates, based on earlier encounters with the F4F Wildcat, had convinced planners that Japanese fighters still held the edge in maneuverability and climb. But the new Hellcat shattered that illusion. It could outclimb, outdive, and even outturn a Zero at high speed. While taking punishment, the Japanese aircraft could not survive. By midday, the reports coming into Admiral Ozawa's flagship painted a grim picture. His once proud air arm was vanishing. Out of 69 aircraft launched in the first wave, only 27 returned. Of the 128 in the second, barely a third limped back, many riddled with bullet holes or leaking fuel. These were not just machines lost. They were the last remnants of Japan's trained aviators. Years of careful instruction, honed through the pre-war period, were gone in a matter of hours. Replacement pilots could be trained, but not experienced. Japan had lost the irreplaceable human core of its air fleet. For those who returned, the psychological scars were deep. Young men who had taken off with songs and prayers now staggered back in silence. They spoke of seeing comrades burn alive, of tracer rounds slicing through cockpits, of an enemy that seemed invincible. Their once proud confidence in the Zero, an aircraft that had defined Japanese might since 1941, was gone. Veterans like Lieutenant Yamamoto, survivors of the early campaigns in China and the South Pacific, stared in disbelief. The tactics that once worked flawlessly, the turning engagements, the vertical spirals, the graceful duels of skill, were now suicide. The Americans no longer fought their war. They fought a new one, dictated by technology and control. On the flight decks of the Japanese carriers, the silence was haunting. Spaces once crowded with aircraft stood nearly empty. Mechanics and armorers waited at their posts with nothing to service, no planes to rearm, no pilots to greet. The human weight of defeat settled across the fleet as names were quietly struck from rosters. Admiral Ozawa faced a terrible choice. A fourth wave of 82 aviators on ADT-82 aircraft sat ready on the decks, Japan's last organized strike force. But reconnaissance reports confirmed the nightmare. The American carriers remained fully operational, their decks teeming with fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes. 3 massed Japanese attacks had done nothing. Launching again would mean sacrificing the last of his air strength for no gain. Yet to retreat meant surrendering Saipan, and with it, Japan's defensive perimeter in the Central Pacific. Communication between command and the air groups broke down completely. Pilots who had survived contradicted one another. Some insisted the enemy fielded hundreds of fighters. Others swore they had seen only a few. Confusion ruled every report. The traditional Japanese belief in spirit and determination blinded many officers to the material truth that technology, organization, and training now outweighed courage alone. Still, Ozawa pressed on. Pride demanded that the Imperial Navy fight to the last. But beneath that resolve, even the senior officers could see the inevitable. The Americans held every advantage. The F6F Hellcat was more than a fighter. It was the embodiment of industrial warfare. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine delivered 2,000 horsepower, almost twice that of the Zero's 130 horsepower Sakai engine. The difference translated into everything that mattered: faster climbs, tighter dives, and dominance at altitude. The Hellcat could climb at 3,500 feet per minute, compared to the Zero's 2,600. It could accelerate out of danger and turn sharply even at high speeds, where the Zero's controls froze under pressure. The Zero, once a graceful predator, was now an underpowered relic. Its firepower told the same story. The Hellcat's 650 caliber Browning machine guns, each capable of firing 850 rounds per minute, unleashed over 100 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition every second. With 400 rounds per gun, a single Hellcat carried enough fire to engage multiple enemies in one sortie. By contrast, the Zero's armament, 2 20mm cannons and 2 7.7mm machine guns, looked impressive on paper, but failed in combat. The cannons carried only 60 rounds each, and their low muzzle velocity forced pilots to aim well ahead of moving targets. The machine guns lacked the power to penetrate armor or ignite self-sealing tanks. Against the rugged American fighters, their bullets simply bounced off. The final blow came not from the skies, but from invisible waves of radar. American ships carried SK air search and SM height-finding radar systems capable of detecting enemy aircraft 100 miles away and pinpointing their altitude within a few hundred feet. Fighter directors used this information to position their interceptors perfectly. before the Japanese pilots even knew they'd been seen. Every advantage, engineering, training, coordination, and technology, now belonged to the United States. Japan's courage remained, but courage alone could not stop the storm. By sunset on June 19th, the Imperial Navy's air arm was no longer a weapon. It was a memory fading into the sea. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had now entered its final act. What began as a duel of courage and machines had evolved into something entirely new. A clash defined by systems, information, and the invisible power of coordination. Aboard the American carriers, air defense was no longer the realm of instinct or individual brilliance. It had become an exact science. Radar operators, plotting boards, and communication officers worked in harmony, transforming scattered pilots into a unified fighting network. Each interception, each turn, each kill, all were guided by data and precision. The Japanese, by contrast, were fighting blind. Their ships relied on human eyes, scanning vast horizons, searching for fleeting specks of movement against endless blue. A handful of vessels carried Type 21 air search radar sets, primitive systems with unreliable range and no altitude-finding capability. The screens flickered with false echoes, ghosts in the static. Coordination was impossible. Without radar guidance, Japanese combat air patrols fought as individuals, using pre-war doctrine designed for clear skies and short distances. Their pilots climbed alone into the unknown, relying on intuition rather than instruction, reacting rather than anticipating. It was courage without coordination, a fatal disadvantage against an enemy guided by technology. By late 1944, the disparity between pilots had grown unbridgeable. The average Japanese Navy pilot graduated with barely 40 hours of total flight time. His American counterpart had logged more than 500, most of it in advanced fighters under combat-like conditions. American aviators trained with camera guns to evaluate their marksmanship and refine their instincts. They learned energy fighting, teamwork, and communication, flying not as lone duelists, but as extensions of one another. Instructors rotated from the front lines, bringing fresh combat experience into training programs. Every lesson reflected the reality of war. For the Japanese, however, reality was something they could no longer afford. Fuel shortages forced them to ground their trainees for weeks at a time. Many pilots never fired a real weapon before combat. Formation flying became a parade exercise rather than a tactical skill. The new Japanese curriculum eliminated aerobatics, instrument flying, and night operations, skills once considered the foundation of mastery. What remained was a hollow echo of the elite pre-war Air Corps. In the skies over the Philippine Sea, that difference would decide everything. Even as wreckage from earlier strikes drifted across the water, Admiral Ozawa gave the order to launch his final wave, 82 aircraft, the last strength of his carrier air arm. He hoped for one meaningful blow before retreating westward. But this fourth wave met an even more lethal sky. By early afternoon, American carriers had refueled, rearmed, and reassembled their defenses. Hellcat patrols now filled the heavens in layered formations, some high, some low, all coordinated through radar and radio. Each Japanese group that approached was intercepted with deadly precision. The pattern was mechanical, relentless, and efficient. By 2:30 p.m., American reconnaissance aircraft had located the Japanese fleet 275 miles to the west-northwest. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, seized the moment. Despite the extreme range, he ordered a massive counterstrike. 216 aircraft launched in one wave, stretching across the sky toward the fading light. Among them were 85 Hellcats, proof that American fighters were no longer tied to defense alone. They had become predators. While the Japanese struggled to put a few scattered fighters in the air, the Americans surged forward with overwhelming strength, reversing roles entirely. When the strike force arrived, the Japanese carriers were nearly defenseless. Out of more than 400 aircraft that had greeted the dawn, only 35 remained operational. The rest lay shattered at the bottom of the sea or burning on flight decks. Hellcats tore through the token defenders, clearing the skies in minutes. Dive bombers and torpedo planes followed, attacking with precision and discipline. The carrier Hio took multiple torpedo hits and sank within the hour. Zuikaku, once the pride of the Pearl Harbor strike force, staggered under a series of bomb impacts. Chiyoda and Chitose burned from stem to stern. Japanese anti-aircraft fire flashed desperately from the decks, but it was uncoordinated, erratic, no match for the disciplined formations diving out of the sun. The American pilots, veterans of countless training missions, pressed their attacks with ruthless calm. By dusk, the U.S. strike groups faced a new challenge: darkness. Many had flown beyond safe fuel limits. Some were already running dry. Finding their carriers in the Black Pacific seemed impossible. Yet Admiral Mitcher made a decision that defied naval convention. He ordered his ships to turn on every light: deck lights, searchlights, even signal lamps, illuminating the ocean like a city at sea. It was a calculated risk. Japanese submarines prowled nearby, but Mitcher prioritized his pilots' lives over ship safety. For the aviators returning through the darkness, that glowing fleet on the horizon was salvation. Some crashed into the sea, others ditched for lack of fuel, but destroyers raced through the waves to pull them from the water. By midnight, 85% of the crews were safely recovered. The next morning, the operation continued as though the night had been only a pause. American search planes took off again at dawn, sweeping westward in pursuit of the shattered Japanese fleet. But the battle was already decided. Ozawa's surviving ships were in retreat, their air groups annihilated. Out of the 430 aircraft that had started the day, barely 36 remained. Japan's elite naval aviation, once the terror of the Pacific, had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The loss ratio was staggering, more than 10-1 in America's favor. Strategically, the implications were devastating. Japan lacked the industrial capacity or fuel reserves to rebuild its carrier air groups. The Imperial Navy would never again challenge American naval air power. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American pilots called it, was more than a battle. It was the death of an entire doctrine. Only a few years earlier, Japanese naval aviation had seemed unstoppable. The Zero fighter had ruled the skies from China to the Coral Sea, its pilots seasoned by endless victories. The combination of long-range agility and combat experience created an aura of invincibility. Allied pilots entered combat expecting defeat. The Hellcat changed all of that. It was not a beautiful aircraft. It was a brute, designed for survival rather than grace. Its heavy armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and massive engine made it impervious to the light. Fragile Zeros. American engineers had studied every weakness of the enemy and built a machine to exploit them all. The result was absolute dominance. The Hellcat's 6 heavy Browning guns shredded Japanese airframes built for maneuverability, not endurance. What once had been a duel of equals became an execution. Yet the Hellcat was only part of a larger system. The industrial system that produced not just machines, but men. The United States trained its pilots through a vast, standardized curriculum, ensuring every aviator reached the same level of competence before combat. Thousands of pilots graduated every month, interchangeable parts in a war machine that never slowed. Japan, bound by tradition and resource shortages, could no longer keep pace. Its training programs turned out pilots too inexperienced to survive their first missions, feeding a cycle of defeat that grew with every battle. Radar-directed fighter control completed the transformation. No longer were carrier groups vulnerable clusters of ships awaiting surprise attack. They had become moving fortresses, guided by information, surrounded by invisible walls of detection and response. Every fighter became part of a single mind, the Combat Information Center, where technology and human skill merged into one lethal system. For Japan, the cost went beyond aircraft and pilots. It was the loss of institutional memory, the destruction of the irreplaceable veterans who had carried the wisdom of pre-war training and early victories. Each fallen pilot took with him lessons that could never be taught again. By June 20th, the skies over Saipan were quiet. Task Force 58 maintained patrols while American troops pressed inland on the beaches below. The few remaining Japanese aircraft fled westward, never to return. For the American pilots who had fought and survived, the memory of the battle carried a strange mixture of pride and disbelief. One of them described it simply, "It was like an old-time turkey shoot." The phrase stuck, and so did the lesson. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was not merely a victory. It was proof that technology, training, and organization could erase the myths of invincibility. Japan's air power, once the symbol of its might, had been shattered in a single decisive day. Only 43 American aircraft fell to Japanese fire over 2 days of relentless aerial combat. A loss so minimal, it seemed almost implausible given the scale of the engagement. The ratio, more than 10-to-1, shattered all previous records for carrier warfare, surpassing even the legendary triumph at Midway. But behind the statistics lay an even more devastating truth for Japan. Over 400 of its most experienced pilots were gone. Many were instructors, veterans pulled from training schools in a desperate attempt to rebuild squadrons that could no longer be replaced. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's report to Combined Fleet Headquarters was blunt and somber. His carriers still floated, some even capable of launching aircraft, but their offensive power had vanished. What remained were ships without pilots, hollow instruments of war deprived of the human skill that once made them formidable. The Mobile Fleet, sent forth with dreams of another Pearl Harbor-style triumph, returned as little more than a symbol of Japan's fading power. For the United States, the Battle of the Philippine Sea marked not just a victory, but a transformation in naval warfare itself. What unfolded across the skies of the Marianas was more than a battle. It was the birth of a new kind of combat. Radar, radio coordination, and precision fighter direction fused into a single integrated system of defense and attack. It was a technological revolution that would shape the design and doctrine of every navy for decades to come. Where Japan clung to tradition, to individual pilot skill, intuition, and spiritual resolve, America had embraced the machine. The emphasis had shifted toward survivability, mass production, and systematic training. The F6F Hellcat, the instrument of this transformation, embodied the new era. Rugged, powerful, and forgiving, it was designed to keep its pilot alive. A radical departure from the lightweight, fragile philosophy that had given birth to Japan's Zero. By 1944, America's factories had become engines of total war. Assembly lines produced thousands of aircraft each month with industrial precision, while training schools turned out pilots by the hundreds, each molded by the same standardized, efficient curriculum. In that single year, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft. Japan, despite mobilizing every possible resource, managed barely 28,000. The contrast was staggering and decisive. Each American loss could be replaced several times over. Each Japanese loss was permanent, a hole that would never be filled. The arithmetic of war had turned against the empire, and no amount of courage could balance the equation. The Hellcat itself became the symbol of this industrial might. Its kill record was unmatched. Over 5,200 confirmed aerial victories for only 270 losses. A 19-to-1 ratio that stood as the highest of any fighter of the war. In the Pacific skies, 3 out of every 4 enemy aircraft downed by the U.S. Navy fell to a Hellcat's guns. Pilots praised its steady handling, its resilience under fire, and its ability to take damage that would have disintegrated a zero. For Japan, the consequences were irreversible. The naval air arm that had once swept across the Pacific, conquering with audacity and precision, now lay in ruins. What remained of its carriers would never again mount a coordinated offensive. In the months that followed, their aircraft would return only as instruments of desperation. Kamikaze weapons piloted by boys with barely any training, sent to die for honor because they could no longer fight for victory. The institutional knowledge, the tactics, the experience, the mentorship, all vanished in a single battle. The Zero, once a symbol of dominance, now represented obsolescence. Against the armored, radar-guided, fire-spitting Hellcat, it was an artifact of a bygone era. Psychologically, the defeat was devastating. Japan's military leadership was forced to confront an unthinkable truth. Courage and devotion could not overcome the cold precision of industrial power. The Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American pilots would later call it, was not merely a battle. It was a reckoning. From Pearl Harbor's ashes in 1941 to the skies over the Marianas in 1944, American naval aviation had undergone a complete metamorphosis. What began as desperate defense had evolved into methodical dominance. The same carriers Japan had hoped to destroy at Pearl Harbor now returned in overwhelming numbers, carrying aircraft superior in every way, and flown by pilots whose training and technology left no room for chance. The Hellcat represented this evolution perfectly. It was not just a fighter. It was the embodiment of American adaptability, a weapon born from analysis, designed to defeat the Zero at every turn, and refined through relentless feedback from the front. Its victories were not accidents of circumstance, but the deliberate result of systematic learning. In his after-action report, Admiral Mark Mitcher praised the flawless coordination between radar, fighter direction, and air defense. Yet he also cautioned that future enemies might not fight the same way. He foresaw that asymmetric threats, unpredictable, desperate, unconventional, could emerge from the ashes of conventional defeat. His words would prove prophetic when Japan, stripped of its air arm, turned to kamikaze tactics in the months to come. Amid the statistics and reports lay the human side of the battle. American pilots recalled the eerie feeling of near-effortless dominance, watching enemy formations disintegrate before even closing to dogfighting range. Some described it as exhilarating, others unsettling. Many expressed sympathy for their opponents, young men flying outdated machines, sent into hopeless battles they could never win. Japanese survivors told a different story, one of helplessness and horror. They spoke of watching entire squadrons vanish within seconds, of seeing friends consumed by flames before they could even fire a shot. For them, it was not a battle, but a massacre in the sky. The Marianas Turkey Shoot was both a military triumph and a human tragedy, a testament to the brutal truth that in modern war, technology and organization could annihilate even the bravest of warriors. By June 1944, the Imperial Navy that had once dictated the tempo of the Pacific War was broken. The strategic consequences extended far beyond the immediate defeat. Japan had lost not only aircraft and carriers, but the ability to wage modern war. The loss of the Shokaku and Taiho to American submarines further compounded the disaster. Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Santa Cruz, went down in flames after torpedoes from USS Kavala ignited fuel vapors on her deck. Taiho, Japan's newest carrier and the pride of her fleet, succumbed to internal explosions from a single torpedo hit. Her crew undone not by enemy fire, but by fatal design flaws. Each sinking represented more than a tactical loss. These ships carried the last concentration of Japan's seasoned air crews and technicians, men whose experience could never be replaced. Their destruction marked the end of Japan's ability to project air power at sea. Meanwhile, American carriers pressed forward relentlessly. What began as a defensive effort in 1942 had become an unstoppable offensive machine by 1944. The once feared Kido Butai, the elite strike force that had terrorized the Pacific, was now reduced to a handful of battered hulls retreating beyond the range of American aircraft. The skies once ruled by the rising sun now belonged entirely to the United States Navy. From Saipan and Tinian, the newly captured airfields would soon host B-29 bombers, bringing the war directly to Japan's home islands. The carrier battle meant to prevent that outcome had instead ensured it. June 19, 1944, became a defining date, the moment American naval aviation achieved total supremacy. Months of rigorous preparation, endless drills, and technological refinement culminated in a few hours of combat that erased Japan's carrier force from the war. The lessons of that day echoed far beyond the Pacific. The integration of radar control, systematic pilot training, and coordinated fleet tactics became the blueprint for post-war naval aviation worldwide. The Hellcat, durable, adaptable, and forgiving, proved that an average pilot in a great aircraft could outperform an expert in an obsolete one. It was the triumph of engineering and training over myth and tradition. For Japan, the cost was measured not only in aircraft and ships, but in the lives of young men sent to die for a lost cause. Many of them never saw their targets. Others simply vanished into the sea. Their courage was undeniable, but courage alone could not defy physics, radar, and firepower. Those who survived carried deep guilt, haunted by the memories of squadron mates lost to futility. They had witnessed the end of an era, the death of a warrior tradition that had defined Japan's naval air arm. In the end, the Battle of the Philippine Sea was not just a contest between fleets. It was a confrontation between two systems, one rooted in individual heroism and spiritual will, the other in industrial organization and scientific precision. The outcome left no doubt which would dominate the modern age. The American carriers that once scrambled to survive now moved with impunity. The Japanese carriers that once symbolized mastery now drifted as wrecks or burned beneath the waves. The Marianas Turkey Shoot became more than a nickname. It became a symbol of overwhelming dominance, of technological ascendancy, and of the turning tide of history. From that point onward, the war's end was only a matter of time. Japan's fate had been sealed not by a single bomb or ship, but by a system, a relentless, disciplined, industrial system that combined technology, training, and tactics into an unbreakable chain of victory. And so, the skies over the Philippine Sea stand as a monument, not just to the courage of those who fought, but to the dawn of modern warfare itself. The Hellcat soared above it all, an iron-winged testament to democracy's arsenal, proving that in the age of total war, mastery belonged not to the bravest, but to the best prepared.